Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop with me, Marcus Simon. I'm your host today. I'm excited to be bringing you all the latest on what's happening at the upcoming General Assembly session. Today, we've got a very special show for you. We're going to be joined by two of my favorite members of the Virginia General Assembly, State Senator Scott Surovell, who is Vice Chair of the Virginia Senate Democrats, and Irene Shin of Herndon in Fairfax County, who's returning to Richmond for just her second year as a member of the House. So we'll get sort of two different perspectives, a House and a Senate, and a grizzly old veteran and a relative newcomer to tell us what's going to go on, give us their insights and priorities for session, and discuss at some point what we expect to be some of the real hot button issues to come out of the session. Every session is defined by something, and we'll see if we can get some guesses as to what the defining issues of this session will be. So, Scott, Irene, welcome.
Thanks,
Marcus. Who you calling Grizzly?
I think he was referring to me.
So, before we get too far into this, just to explain to our audience. So, the General Assembly in Virginia meets every year. We gavel in on the second Wednesday of January for either a long or a short session. In even years, we meet for a 60-day session where we actually do a biennial budget. So we give ourselves a little bit more time for that, and we last for, again, a good 60 days until the beginning of March. The odd years are election years for us, and in theory, since we've already done the biennial budget, we don't need as much time for a session. So we come back for a 30-day session, which may be extended by up to another 30 days. The traditional path in these odd years lately has been for us to extend it to a 46-day session. That's what we expect will happen this year. So we're back for our short session. It's 46 days. We don't have a new budget to do, but as you'll hear, there is a lot going on with the budget, and there's about several $1 billion in budget amendments. So we have that to tackle. So this is a short year. It's also an election year for everybody. So you'll expect to see a certain number of brochure bills and some antics on the floor and other places that you might attribute to people's primary concerns. But before we get into that, let's talk to Senator Surovell and Delegate Shin about what they're up to, what their priorities for the session are, and what bills they've got. So, Scott, let's start with you. You are you're the vice chair, as I said, of the Virginia Senate Democratic Caucus. You've represented Eastern Fairfax County since 2010. You started out, I guess, 6 years in the House of Delegates. I was there with you when we overlapped for several years, and then moved on to the state Senate, the lower chamber in the Virginia system. You live in Mount Vernon with your wife, and you have 4 kids, some of whom are still at home and some are off at college. You practice law in Fairfax. And you've dedicated your legislative career, it says here, to fighting for Northern Virginia's fair share, protecting consumers, and preserving our environment for future generations. So that is Scott Surovell. Scott, tell us a little bit about what you're up to, what your big plans are for this coming January.
Sure. And by the way, you left out that about half my district today is in Prince William County, and I represent another 20,000 people in Stafford County, although that's all probably about to change. But yeah, it's been my honor to represent Fairfax this will be my 14th session, I think, which is pretty scary to me. A couple of things. First of all, as you know, I hardly ever carry very many bills, but we do have a bill limit this year of 26 bills, which means I'm going to be carrying about 30. And if you take all my bills in subparts, it'd probably be closer to 40 or 45. But I'll be introducing probably about 30 bills, and the reason I can get around the bill limit is in the Senate. If we're on a commission or something, we're allowed to carry a commission bill if that doesn't count towards our limit. So in any event.
You also, guys, in the Senate have adopted a rule. So in the House, we have bill limits. So I should have said this at the outset, right? For the short session. In the House, we have a 15 bill limit. But you guys in the Senate adopted something that I hear around Richmond is called the Surovell rule, which is also a limit on the number of bills you can request for the Legislative Services Division to draft for you. Is that right?
We adopted a theoretical drafting limit. I pointed out to my colleagues that the drafting requests that we submit to the Division of Legislative Services are actually attorney-client privileged, and that for anybody to blow a whistle on somebody violating that limit, it would be a violation of attorney ethics. And so it's really a rule without any teeth, because it's impossible to enforce. So, but in theory they did that, but I don't think anybody pays any attention to it. So
but it is called the Surovell rule at any rate. But anyway, go ahead.
No, actually, the drafting rule was not about me. The bill limit was probably about me. But the drafting rule, there was a couple of House members who were having like 100 bills drafted and then trying to hand out bills like lollipops to new members.
Yeah,
that was sort of causing some consternation, I think. But anyway, but the bill limit, that was probably, I might have had something to do with that. So, a couple of the big things I'm carrying. Fairfax County people would probably recall the situation that occurred with our school system, where it was learned that a convicted sex offender was working at a middle school in Fairfax County, and because it's not really clear what happened, whether the Chesterfield Sheriff's Office didn't notify Fairfax, or whether the email never got opened, or whether they typed in the wrong email address or something. But under Virginia law, if somebody is charged with a sex offense and they're known to work at a school system, the police are supposed to notify the school system of the arrest. And then after they're convicted, the clerk is supposed to notify the school system of the conviction. And that didn't happen. And then this guy went out and got charged with the exact same thing, at which point they did finally notify Fairfax, and he was promptly, of course, fired. But it's still not clear what happened with the notification process. And but it seemed to me preposterous that, some police department in some far reaches of Virginia have to make a phone call to Scott Braband's office at, Fairfax County Superintendent's office, which manages a $5 billion budget and has 180,000 students, to try to figure out where to send a notice. And so basically I have a bill that says that the Secretary of Education has to get an email address, a phone number, and a fax number to receive these notices from every school system in the state, put it on their website, and then in the future, notice has to be made by certified mail, return receipt requested, or by fax and email to one of those places on that list, so that we have a paper trail showing that notice was attempted and made, or it was rejected. And I think it's a lot more likely these notices will be made that way. In addition, it says that if somebody's arrested for a sex offense, the law enforcement is required to check with the Virginia Employment Commission to confirm what their employment is, so they can't lie. This guy apparently also lied about where he worked, and so if you lie about your employment and you do work in the school system, that'll be discovered. And so I think that'll solve that problem, and hopefully give a lot more people a lot of peace of mind that we don't have sex offenders working in our school system. So
I recall that when that happened. And we'll talk about this probably some more in the second half, but we had some folks in Richmond trying to politicize that and make this like some sort of a failure of a woke school system. And it sounds like there's, we dug into it a little bit, there were some systemic problems and some breakdowns that really nobody could have anticipated, but now that we know about, we can go about fixing. So glad to see you're working on that. What else you got going on?
Yeah, I don't know anybody that wants people who solicit minors in prostitution to be serving in our school system. I don't know any system on the planet that wants that. But so a couple other things. I'm working on a bill to clean up our red flag law. We adopted a red flag law back in 2020 on a bipartisan basis to basically say that if you're threatening to injure or kill people, you're a threat to use your gun to hurt people, that the police can go to a magistrate or a judge and get an order to have your guns taken away from you. And President Trump actually supports that legislation. And we modeled ours on a Florida law. And that law has been used a lot, actually, in Fairfax, over 100 times, I think. It's been used around the state. We have probably about half our jurisdictions in the state that haven't used it at all. And I don't think that's because they have a lack of opportunities. It's just either don't understand the law or don't want to use it. Basically, the bill I have sort of makes it clear a whole bunch of different factors that the court has to look at to ascertain whether somebody's at risk to themselves or others, including whether or not they've expressed any suicidal ideations or attempted to hurt themselves or others, whether they have other acts of violence that have occurred recently, whether they've made any recent ammunition or gun purchases, whether they've hurt animals, for example, because there's a pretty strong correlation between hurting animals and hurting other people. So anyways, it lists out the factors that courts are supposed to look at to ascertain whether somebody's at risk to themselves or others. So right now, the law just doesn't say anything. It just says if you're deemed to be a risk. It doesn't say here's all the things you look at.
Right. So this will give us some more consistent application across the Commonwealth and give judges a little bit more guidance about what is it that I'm supposed to be thinking about when I'm issuing these orders or deciding not to issue these orders.
Yeah, that's right. I'm carrying a bill to clean up our community solar law. And a lot of people are like, well, what's community solar? So in a lot of areas, like, for example, the part of Fairfax I represent, it got built out between like about 1940 and 1970. And because of that, a lot of my neighborhoods that I represent have a lot of heavy tree cover. And so it doesn't make sense to put solar panels on your roof because they just don't generate a lot of electricity. I also represent a lot of people that don't own their roof because they live in an apartment building or a condo, or you have a lot of small businesses that don't own their roof. And so most people who are in that situation and maybe want to purchase green energy or solar energy, they don't want to make a 20-year commitment, or they don't have the capital, or they don't have the sun to put panels on their roof, but they still want to get solar energy instead of, getting energy from frack gas or coal. We have a little bit of coal left and we're phasing it out. And the bill I passed basically said that a solar provider can put up a small packet of panels, about 20 acres of panels somewhere, and then you can purchase a percentage of the output and net it against your bill in your house or your business. But we had this fight about what kind of minimum bill you had to pay to Dominion to cover the costs for the lines coming to your house, or for the backup power that you have, or for example, coal ash cleanup. We're still cleaning up coal ash from the last 80 years of coal pollution. So it had a minimum bill, and the problem is our state corporation commission decided that the minimum bill that had to be put for these types of arrangements was so high. None of the community solar providers are willing to come into Virginia and sell community solar to people like you and me. There was a low income component which has no minimum bill, and that project's going great, but it was never intended to be that. It was supposed to be a program that everybody could benefit from. And so I have a bill to basically give us a reasonable minimum bill that will make the program economic, so that if you live in a neighborhood with heavy tree cover like me, or you live in an apartment, or you have a small business, or maybe you're not planning on living somewhere for 20 years, and maybe you only plan on living there 5, you can still go out and buy solar energy to power your house. And so that's a bill that I'm carrying to clean up.
That's interesting. Of course, the folks that lobby, I'm sure, since we gave the authority to the State Corporation Commission to determine what a minimum bill should be, the folks at Dominion Energy have a lot of experience, and a lot of experienced litigators and attorneys who are used to working that system. So sounds like we've got to come back and say, okay, that's not what we meant. We meant a real minimum bill, and we've got to be more directive about it.
Yep. So one other bill in the energy space I'm carrying is a bill to we have this commission called the Commission on Utility Regulation, which is supposed to meet and discuss utility policy. And its last meeting was in 2015. And so I serve on that commission. I've tried to get meetings to happen, and I'm not going to get into why they haven't happened, but my legislation basically requires the commission to have regular meetings. It gives it full-time staff to conduct policies and to give us policy advice. It requires the governor to present his energy plan to us every year. It requires the State Corporation Commission to come and give us regular updates on all the laws that we passed and how they're being implemented. And it gives us a place to talk about energy policy in a public environment where the public can come and hear us have dialogue and come and pitch ideas to us, and where business can come and talk about why they think things are too expensive or why we need to change things. But right now, I think there's a real perception that when we make energy policy, it's sort of done behind closed doors and smoke-filled rooms, because the only time the public gets to see us doing anything is in like 15-minute increments in a committee hearing. And I think we really need a place where we can have really lengthy, robust policy discussions about our energy policy, sort of where we are, where we're going. And this would facilitate all that. And there's actually a lot of interest in the bill on both the environmental side and the utility side. I think everybody agrees that we really need to have more dialogue about this in public. So that's a good segue. I want to we'll come back to you for a second, but that's a good segue. You're talking about this commission that never meets. You and I served on a comprehensive or a joint committee to study comprehensive campaign finance reform. I chaired it when we were in control of the House. We actually had meetings, and we made some recommendations. We had a report. We didn't finish because there's a lot to it, but we actually created a report, interim report. We had recommendations. We worked on some bills, and that commission
or the committee, since Republicans took over the House and co-chairmanship of it, hasn't been able to meet. So Irene, I know that that's a topic that you're interested in. And I know you haven't made your decisions yet exactly about which bills you're going to drop or not. And we'll talk a little bit about, what the prospects are for big new ideas in a session like this when we get to the more global climate of the General Assembly. But tell us a little bit about what you've been working on. If you don't mind starting off with the campaign finance and ethics stuff that you're thinking about.
Sure, definitely. I think first, I want to say that I was accused recently of being like Senator Surovell because in spite of
it's a compliment. You mean not accused? You were complimented by being compared to Senator Surovell.
In spite of having a 15 bill limit, I also requested upwards of 40 drafts. And they were like, Irene, what are you doing? You're being like Senator Surovell. And I was like, oh, okay, great. I think those are some good shoes to try and follow in. But with the narrow number of bills that we're able to introduce this session, I'm trying to figure out, as you said, Delegate Simon, exactly what I want to introduce. And one of the considerations,
bills, make the omnibus, like the Irene Shin Omnibus Government Reform Act.
Yeah, it's actually what we're calling right now the Campaign Finance Omnibus Reform Bill, right? So it's got a couple of elements that I think are really important as we think about campaign finance. One is having an enforcement mechanism with the Council of or the Ethics Council that exists. Right now, the Ethics Council that is housed at DLS without any formal staff allocated to it, they don't really have any enforcement mechanisms to say if someone violates a campaign finance rule, there are very few consequences to face. And I think that is one, it's poor form for transparency, and two, it means that folks who are in constant or consistent violation of campaign finance rules have no incentive to actually not be in violation of campaign finance rules. The second piece of the omnibus bill is also around public financing, because I think that we can talk a lot, as much as we want, about campaign contribution limits from certain actors, certain players, and we can talk about capping it at 10,000 or 5,000 for all sorts of different donors, whether they're individuals or companies or PACs. But all of that is sort of irrelevant and a moot point, because by inherently doing that, we are also going to be limiting the kind of pipeline and the kind of candidates that are able to enter into the political arena. So folks who come from, traditionally disadvantaged backgrounds, folks who don't have rich lawyer friends, as I sit here with two attorneys in the General Assembly, right? It makes it really hard to run and raise money, even in a seat that is, maybe as safe as ours is. And so I think that the public financing piece is really interesting to me. And also, if we look at places like Maine, they've done such a good job of implementing public financing as a means to run clean campaigns. And it's less about the mechanics of the law, but more about the culture they've been able to cultivate, and saying if this candidate is unwilling to opt into clean campaigns and public financing, why would we vote for them? Why are they not opting in for more transparency as a candidate and to run for office? And the third piece of it is obviously the thing that is the most, Wild Westy about Virginia, is the lack of campaign contribution limits. We currently, General Assembly members, candidates running for state level or local office, can take money and accept money in any amount from any individual and also from corporations. And I think that begs a lot of questions about, in spite of some of the rules that we do have around transparency and reporting requirements, I think it still allows a ton of opportunity for opacity. And so I think making sure that we have transparency around who is funding our candidates and what those motives might be, I think our electorate is entitled to know that. And so I fully believe in making sure that we're limiting the kind of actors who are able to contribute. And really, this is a thing that I've been focused on, campaign finance, for a long time in the work that I've done as an organizer and in working for a company called CrowdPack. But also, when having now been in the legislature myself, I think that transparency is always good and sunshine is always good. We want to try and limit the kind of backroom shenanigans, or having corporations have undue influence in our legislation, including any sort of hint of pay to play tactics that are happening, right? We want to make sure that our electorate is fully confident in our legislature and our elected officials' abilities to be accountable only to those folks who are voting for us.
Yeah, it's interesting. Virginia always gets ranked very low on this swamp index that people put out. I've worked on this issue, and I know Senator Surovell has. We've worked together on this joint committee, and you've sort of identified the three right issues. It's interesting. I don't know of another state that's been able to accomplish what you're describing. Maybe Maine has, but localities. But I think one of the keys, right, is to, if we could succeed, is to create a culture where you're expected to opt in to this clean campaign policy, and the cost of not being labeled, a clean campaigner or someone who's opted in politically is greater than the cost of contributions you can't take. And so figuring out where that equilibrium is sort of the key to the success of programs like that. I know, like in Montgomery County at a local level, they have a system. If you're not willing to opt into the voluntary, limits, that it's difficult for you to make progress as a candidate. We had that in the presidential for a while until I think Obama could raise enough money on his own that it became fashionable to just opt out. The money got so big that everybody decided to opt out of the public financing piece of presidential campaigns. But those are all good things to work on. And I think you've also identified one of the other problems, which is that money kind of finds a way. And so if you have contribution limits to individual PACs, then you got to figure out, that money's going to get spent somewhere. And if it comes in the form of independent expenditures, which can be more opaque, or if it comes through PACs, which in Virginia right now, we don't have any limitation on coordination with PACs. You can have a super PAC that can take unlimited contributions and tell them exactly what you want them to do with the money. So it's a big lift, but I think I think we can make some progress there, and we certainly need to. So thank you. What else you got going on?
Well, I was just to respond to that. I think it's a big lift, but I think that chipping away at it piece by piece is just like dragging out the fight. I think there's a number of states that have all of these laws in place, right? California, Connecticut, New York, Maine, Arizona, right? They have transparency laws. They have public financing options and like that. I think that breeds the culture of, transparency that we want to, like you said, make sure that everyone feels pressured to opt into clean campaigns and running a transparent campaign. So I don't know that that's going to pass this year.
I agree. I agree. The omnibus has the advantages of being comprehensive, right? Because a lot of these things don't work one without the other, right? If you just do limits, but you don't have any regulations on independent expenditures or the same disclosure requirements for those, then the money slides over into the darker arena. And so you don't have a public option. So, it's harder to accept the limit. So it all has, like you said, it has to work together ultimately. And that's sort of what the commission, the joint committee was going to try and do. The whole concept was to do a comprehensive look, because doing it one piece at a time, it's easy to say why this isn't going to work, right? If you're just looking at one piece of it. So I admire the effort. I'm not.
Well, I think we're realistic. I think I'm being realistic about the landscape in the House.
Gotcha.
And
so we got about 5 minutes before the break. Tell me what else you've got working on that you want to make sure everybody knows about.
My utility disconnections bill. And when Senator Surovell talked about the utility commission that hasn't met since 2015, my ears perked up, because I was like, wow, I wish that did exist, and I wish they had met, because that would have been a huge advantage in the way that we've drafted this bill. Last year, we introduced HB 1054, which was a bill that would have limited utility disconnections for non-payment when there are states of emergency, public health crises, or extreme weather events. And this really stemmed from an experience that I had in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic, right? It's May 2020. We are being told by the CDC to come home, wash your hands with scalding hot water and lots of soap. And, you've got all these graphics floating around the proper way to wash your hands. And so that's where we are. We don't know how COVID is being transmitted. And I'm hearing from Petersburg that the municipality, the city of Petersburg, has shut off people's water for non-payment. And I think about how unconscionable that is, because, we're talking about not only like their individual health, but also about community health and the way that this disease is being spread. There were a number of customers that had already had their water shut off because of non-payment, and Petersburg continued to leave it off, and then also added more customers in which they were turning off water for non-payment. And a lot of those folks, when pre-pandemic, they were going to the YMCA to take showers. They were going to the restaurant down the street from them to use their bathroom during the day. But, the state is being locked down, and the YMCA is no longer open. That restaurant is no longer open, and these folks are out of work. And for some of these bills, they were as high as $300, $400, $500. And the terms of restoration of service includes paying off the entirety of your arrearages. And it was an insurmountable amount for a lot of these customers. And so I worked with Delegate Aird at the time to try to address this in Petersburg and make sure that folks had their water back on. And so, we were successful in that fight, but it really, for me, like lit a fire in my belly around like, it's unconscionable to think that we're turning off basic utilities like gas, electricity, and water in the middle of public health crises. And so last year, HB 1054 would have attempted to do that. It died in committee. Unsurprisingly, but Chairwoman Byron and Chairman Saslaw in the Senate, they were kind enough to write a letter to the SEC asking them to do a study over the year and then to report back recommendations. The SEC released their report just last month, and we're really, really optimistic about the fact that they say this is actually good law and this is good policy to codify and standardize across the state to ensure that folks have access to electricity when it's 95 degrees and above, and to have access to gas when it's 32 degrees and below. And so I'm coming back for a second bite at that apple, and I'm feeling pretty good about it and hoping that we can make some progress this year.
Yeah, with a favorable recommendation for the SEC, it's funny, as a new member, you learn, right? A lot of times if it's a new idea or one they're just not comfortable with, it's a convenient way to punt. But and sometimes they'll come back. It took me 5 years in a row to get some regulation of student loan servicing companies, and the State Corporation Commission didn't want to do that. We kept asking the State Corporation Commission if they wanted to do it or not. Finally, it took Democrats running the place to tell the State Corporation Commission, we don't care if you want to or not. You're going to do it. Mm-hmm. So listen, we'll have a little more time on the other side of the break if there's more bills that you guys want to talk about. But I'm looking forward to really getting into question one, whether we think the prospects are for this legislation or any legislation this session, because we haven't talked yet about the fact that we're a divided government and we've got a Republican governor, Republican House, but a narrow Republican House and a narrow Democratic Senate. So we'll talk a little bit about how that works, what we expect to see, and what some really big issues that'll probably dominate some of the conversation. I think we'll probably see some stuff on things like abortion, and we're going to have some stuff on fundamental rights and freedoms like the freedom to marry and voting rights and so forth. So I look forward to getting y'all's take. I know we'll get a Senate perspective and a House perspective. I've got my own perspective on how that looks. And so we've got about another 27 minutes or so coming up after the break. But right now, you guys are watching the Inside Scoop preview of the 2023 General Assembly session with Senator Scott Surovell, the vice chair of the Senate Democratic Caucus, and with relatively new delegate Irene Shin. And we'll also talk about your background, Irene, and where you got into politics and who you might have worked for in Richmond before. And I'm your guest host today, Marcus Simon. I represent the 53rd District, which is Fairfax and Falls Church. And so we will be back right after these brief messages.
Caitlin, be serious. No, take the oath. Come on. I'm totally taking this seriously. Okay, I'm ready. You may begin. I pledge that I will never meet in person with anyone I first met online without checking with my parent or guardian. And furthermore, if my parent or guardian agrees to the meeting, it will be in a public place and my parent or guardian must come along. Do you pinky swear? I do.
When you teach your kids about internet safety, they'll pass it on. For more information, go to cableclicksmart.org.
Today I'm going to talk to you about physics. Come on in, girls. Let's go. This is the first rocket to get humans to Mars.
Really tall.
I'm a rocket structural engineer, designing and building parts of the rocket. You are the generation that will be stepping foot on Mars. Do I have a group of astronauts on my hands?
Yes.
You can become a rocket scientist or whatever else you want to be.
So how was work?
It was 1,300 hours. My math class from 302 was in the trenches. Davy Roth had it the worst. Fractions were coming at him left and right. He just didn't get the damn things. 2 days ago, I tried to teach him what 1/4 of 1/2 was using different sizes of blocks. Yesterday, I tried again by dividing up pizza. Both missions failed.
Oh no.
But today, I was ready. I created a combat math game where the only way to beat the enemy is to out-fraction them. Davy conquered every last denominator. My game was so successful, the principal is deploying it to math squadrons all over the school. Anywho, how was your day?
Oh, today my boss treated the office to salad wraps.
Salad wraps.
No.
Your blood pressure numbers could change your life. Talk to your doctor about creating a plan that works better for you. Start taking the right steps at manageyourbp.org.
Get it.
Get it.
Get it.
Give your town a reason to celebrate, because every Goodwill item you bring home brings job training and more to your community. Goodwill, bring good home.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your guest host today, Delegate Marcus Simon. I am here with State Senator Scott Surovell, who represents the senator from Eastern Fairfax, I think is what they call him on the floor, although his current district includes parts of Prince William and Stafford County, vice chair of the Senate Democratic Caucus. And I've got Delegate Irene Shin, who represents the town of Herndon and Fairfax, and right now some Loudoun County pieces, but in the future, and we'll talk about this at the end here, maybe if we have time, it'll be an all Fairfax County district. We just went through some of Senator Surovell and some of Delegate Shin's individual sort of legislative agenda items. But I wanted to take a minute to talk about what we expect out of this session, right? So, we've been watching the dysfunction and the drama in the federal government in the House of Representatives. I can't tell you as of this taping whether we'll have a Speaker of the House or not by the time this airs. Whether we do or not is anybody's guess. But in Virginia, we tend to get along a little bit better. But we're going to, that's going to be sort of tested. This idea that we have a different way, a Virginia way of doing things is going to be tested. We have a Republican governor in Virginia who is fresh off the national campaign trail, where he spent a good part of 2022 on the road campaigning for, I would consider far right as well as regular right members, people running for governor and state and Senate and so forth. He's back in Richmond now, and now he's got to deal with a state Senate that is controlled by Democrats, including our vice chair of the Democratic Caucus, Senator Surovell. But we've got a Republican House with a narrow 52-48 majority. But in the House, we have a strong speaker system. And so as narrow as that majority is, the majority party has a lot of power to control the agenda and decide what gets heard. So, Scott, what do you think the prospects are? I know that the governor can't get anything done without 21 senators voting for it. And so you guys have some leverage. So what do you think the likely mood is going to be in Richmond when we get back down there in January?
Well, by the way, it's currently a 51-47 environment and a 21-18 environment in the Senate, because we have 3 special elections that are taking place on Tuesday. And so, the first thing I think everybody's looking for in the Senate is what happens in our special election. That's in the Senate. That's the thing everybody's watching right now. And we have a special election in the seat that Jen Kiggins just vacated to move up to Congress. And the Senator Kiggins, actually, I don't call her congressman yet because she hasn't been sworn in yet because we don't have a speaker. But Senator Kiggins actually lost her Senate seat in her congressional race. And so we're very optimistic that that's a seat we might actually flip. It would be the first Senate seat to flip in a special election to the Democratic side since Mark Herring, I think, back in 2005. So, or no, I'm sorry, it was Senator Marsden who flipped Cuccinelli's seat in 2010. And if that happens, then our body would go to 22-18, which I think could, change a few things. But, the governor's conduct over the last year has really been disappointing to me. He's really spent a lot more time sort of campaigning with election deniers and sort of well-known ideologues instead of really focusing on his relationships with people in Virginia. And in the 14 years I've served, I think the governors who've been the most effective are the ones who really spend time in Richmond, and they spend time building their relationships with people in not just the majority, but also in the minority. Because, when you start to work on legislation in earnest, you really have to know people well. You have to have a level of trust and confidence in your dialogue and discussions with them. They'll remain, confidential, or that you can trust somebody when they say they're going to do something further than the legislative process or whatever. And, I haven't spoken to the governor in probably 10 months now. He called me right after he won, and I haven't heard from him since, really, except a couple parties during session we went to at his mansion. So, we'll see. I mean, he's proposed this $1 billion tax cut, which I think is not going anywhere. I don't have any constituents of mine that are asking me to please set the corporate tax rate below what I have to pay. Our Virginia, our top tax rate is 5.75%. And he wants businesses to pay, I think it's like 5% or foreign change or something. I don't think that's going anywhere. We just cut taxes by $2.3 billion. We had to sacrifice a lot of priorities last year for that, including, for example, mental health. Now the governor wants to spend money on mental health that we could have spent last year. We could have solved this problem last year if we hadn't cut taxes so aggressively. Social Security just implemented a 7% plus COLA increase for Social Security beneficiaries. I think our state employees have only got a 5% raise so far. I think they deserve a lot more than they've got. I think our teachers need a much bigger raise than we've got them. We don't have room to be cutting taxes right now, especially with the recession staring us in the face. And so I think that whole dialogue is going to take up a lot of oxygen as we sort of work through that in the budget process. There's a lot of talk about abortion policy because it's really hot right now because of about the Dobbs case that just came down. I think you might see some bills come out of the House. You guys are going to have some really hot debates on your side as they try to push bills out to protect themselves in their primaries and make their base happy. They're going to come over to our side, go to the Senate Ed and Health Committee, and be killed the first day after crossover, probably. And if there's any further action on abortion, it'll probably happen via the budget if it does, and they'll probably try and slip some budget amendments through. If the special election goes the way I hope it will, then that's going to be a non-issue. If the special election does not go well, then who knows? It could get interesting. But there's a couple of abortion policy things that are in the budget, like for example, funding for abortions for fetuses that have really serious abnormalities. I don't know why the governor wants to prohibit those types of abortions. They happen maybe once or twice a year. I think there's been like 7 in a decade or something, and it's really heartless stuff to sort of force a woman to give birth to a child that isn't viable because she can't afford health insurance. But that's basically what he's proposed, along with putting money in the budget to incarcerate women who violate his new abortion ban, which is interesting. But so anyway, we'll probably have a lot of dialogue about that this session, but I don't expect a lot of policy movement on it, given our current political environment, being Democrats controlling the Senate and Republicans controlling everything else. Beyond that, there's going to be a lot of talk, I think, about energy bills. There's this talk about repealing the clean car rule that we passed that allows Virginians to get access to EVs, which is why we passed it. Right now, a lot of EVs that are driven in Northern Virginia are bought in Maryland because they're very hard to get here. And because of the law we passed in about a year, you're going to get a lot more access to EVs in Northern Virginia, a lot more selection, a lot more lower prices. And there's going to be an effort to repeal that, also to get us out of Reggie, which isn't going anywhere. We're going to stay in Reggie. And that'll probably be solved in the courts eventually. What else? There's also going to be a lot of efforts to repeal a lot of the criminal justice reform bills that we passed about in the 2020 special session. I've already seen a bunch of those repeal bills introduced. I don't expect any of those to pass. I think anything that was going to happen on that happened last session. So my guess is we'll have a lot of stasis on that. But you're right, Marcus. I mean, I think a lot of people feel like we fight a lot. There's fighting that happens in front of the cameras every once in a while, but 98% of the time, we're all getting along and talking and enjoying each other's company. And most of the bills that pass are the really bills that pass on tight ideological margins are few and far between. There's usually maybe like what, 2 or 3% of the 3,000 bills we work on.
Yeah, there's a website, vpap.org, that tracks close votes, right? And it's usually just a handful. I mean, there may be a number of them, but there's just a few issues where we'll vote party line. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that it's almost all, if you compare the docket on a typical calendar, we have something called the uncontested docket, which is the stuff that everybody voted for. And that's usually 3 or 4 times as many bills as the contested docket, right? So most of the stuff comes through, people work on it in good faith, and they're trying to solve real problems that their constituents face and other people face and tweak things. I'm a little nervous. I'll be honest with you. I'm a little nervous about your red flag tweaks because I know that there's folks on our side that would love to get rid of that bill altogether. I don't think the governor even is interested in doing that, but there could be they could try to make some hay with that one. But Irene, you were a
now that you tuned in, I was able to see the soda behind my head. I've been trying to find the soda, and the Zoom helped me find it. So
there we go. Now you can stop drinking out of that bottle. So Irene, you were a freshman last year, and you came in with a bunch of interesting characters. So what's your take on? It's funny. We talk about how we mostly get along and enjoy each other's company. I'm going to digress for just a second. Two of your classmates in the house, Irene, are probably the exception to that rule. And that's Delegate Ren Williams and Delegate Marie Marsh. I assume you know both of them, got to know them a little bit during orientation. They've got a big primary against each other. Redistricting put them together in the same district. And I think Delegate March accused Delegate Williams of assault. They actually had a trial and it went to court and he was found not guilty. And so, I've asked the speaker to put them on the same committees and seat them next to each other just for entertainment's sake. And he's told me he'll consider it, but if I bring the popcorn. So, Delegate, you tell us a little bit about your first year, what you were sort of surprised by, and what your expectations are as far as the House is concerned in a short session campaign year with a lot of primaries going on.
Well, I think I've learned a lot just in this conversation and knowing what to expect in a short session, because I also don't know what to expect in a short session. But in the first year that I've been here, I think the most remarkable thing has been what Alfonso Lopez said to me during our freshman orientation meeting. And he said, "Don't worry, you'll learn by osmosis." And at the time, I was so frustrated by that statement because I was like, what do you mean I'll learn by osmosis? Like, I want to read things. Tell me how this will work. And sure enough, there was no better way to learn than through osmosis and like just being in the building. Delegate Simon, you referenced this before, but I've worked in and around the building for a few years as a community advocate, as an activist, and also working in one member's office for a couple of sessions. One said member from Falls Church, no other than Delegate Marcus Simon himself from the 53rd. And, those experiences working with you and in your office was one of the best experiences for me to understand how the legislative process works. So I like to think that I came in with a little bit of understanding. And I tell people all the time, having worked with Delegate Simon, I was like, I know how the sausage is made in there. And I got here and I was like, this is not what I was expecting, right? It's a whole nother ball game. It's like a whole different sausage. So, and I think
the different conversations that happen in the big office, right? I mean, there's two offices for those that are watching. There's a legislative aids office. A lot of action happens in the LA's office, and then there's the member has a slightly larger office. And at mine, it's almost equal because Andrea insists that we should have an equally sized office. But yeah, those conversations once you get onto that side of the wall are a little bit different. I'm sure you figured that out.
Yeah. I think that there's also like a very real experience that I had in thinking, I look pretty young. I am short. I'm 5 feet tall in stature. So everyone just assumes I'm really young. But it was like day one of last year's session. I've got my backpack on in the elevator and everyone's like, wow, we're back in person. Aren't we so excited to be here? And someone looks at me and goes, so whose office are you working for? And I was like, oh, I work in my office. And we kept tally the entire session to see how many times people would ask me who I worked for, because there's this baseline assumption that someone, who might be a woman might be an AAPI woman, who might be a woman who's young looking. And I think that there was just baseline assumption where folks thought I had to be somebody's staffer. And that was fun to contest that and be like, no, actually, and I can challenge that and say, no, I was elected by the people of the 86th district and I'm here to serve them. That's whose office I work for. But I would say that was a big learning experience for me, just like challenging folks' baseline assumptions about who belongs in those halls and then who belongs
Irene,
in that building.
Just remember that at age 51, I'm the third youngest member of the Senate Democratic Caucus. So,
third. Yeah.
Well,
I think the median age is a lot higher than it is in the House.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. We talk about they have a Geritol drip in the back room where we have food. So, it's interesting. I'll give you a little bit more advice here just on camera, but here's what to look out for in this short session, particularly in an election year, is our morning hour is going to be a lot longer because everybody's going to need to make a speech about everything. And they're trying to make tape for themselves because it's cheaper than hiring a consultant to actually make a professional videotape. So you have a lot of folks that think they need to use the morning hour to make YouTube videos that they can send out to their lists and their campaign lists. And I think in the House, we're going to see, and Senator Surovell, you alluded to this a little bit, but I think we are going to see an abortion ban of some length. And I think they will muscle that through. And I think it's going to be interesting to have to deal with that. It's going to come out of committee. It's going to be a lengthy floor debate. I think that there'll be an effort on both sides to paint the other side as the extreme. They'll say that, our position is that they'll go back to the Ralph Northam piece of audio and take that out of context and say we support abortion up to the moment of and after birth. And we're going to suggest that this is really not a decision that the legislature ought to be making at all. So I think there's going to be a bigger discussion, and it'll happen, on tax policy too. I mean, I think you'll get a more aggressive corporate tax cutting out of the House side of the budget. And there'll be an exercise really to get that bill into conference, which is where the real deals will get made. I think also this, the environmental stuff is interesting. I think there might be some common ground on a couple of things, though, and I'm interested to hear y'all's take. I think an area where there's some consensus is on mental health, that we're not doing enough, that we're not funding it properly. And I think both sides, for different reasons, maybe are interested in starting to address that. I know the governor's got some money for mobile crisis units and mobile response and things like that. I don't know if that's enough money. I was at an event the other day, and Delegate Polchik from Fairfax pointed out that Fairfax spends more than what the governor's proposed just in Fairfax County alone. So what he's proposing in the state budget, won't do a ton to address the issue. But what do you guys think the areas of potential compromise or some common ground might be where we could actually get something done in spite of the fact that it's an election year and everybody's trying to get an advantage over everybody else? Irene, do you have any thoughts about that?
I was surprised last year that the common ground we found was in beagles. So I don't know what we'll see this year, right, in the common ground. I think there'll be
Did you say legal or beagles? Oh, you went the
beagles. Yeah, the
beagles,
4,000.
right.
We saved 4,000 beagles from that terrible facility in Vigo. And who knew that beagles would be the thing that brought Senator Stanley and Delegate Rob Bell together with Senator Boysko and me and Delegate Shelley Simons from Virginia Beach. So I think that was an interesting team to save the beagles, but I love that. And I think this year, like you said, there's a surprising number of bills that pass with bipartisan support. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the stats that I had pulled earlier. In 2022, there were 2,200 bills that were introduced, and 40% of them were passed. So significant number, and of the 40% of those bills that were passed, 67% of them were passed with bipartisan support. So I think that it's often that you find that these bills, stuff around stormwater drainage that comes before CCNT, or, whose courthouse gets to belong in what district and jurisdiction. I think those are the kinds of things that we'll see a lot of bipartisan support on, just the minor improvements that the legislators and members want to make for their constituents and in their home districts and counties.
Gotcha. Scott, what do you think? What do you think we might actually do something on?
Well,
you look puzzled. You look concerned. Maybe not.
No, well, I mean, first of all, I think you look, for example, at what happened to JLARC can provide some roadmaps for a few things to look at. And one of the things that came out of JLARC that I'm working on, and for some reason I don't know anybody else picked this up, but the Virginia 529 plan. First of all, college affordability is always an issue for people, and I think there's a sense that our tuition's too high, and also enough people that can't afford college can't go. And the Virginia 529 plan, it turns out, has generated a $1.3 billion surplus over the last 20 years. And there's a dispute about what to do with that $1.3 billion. And I felt very strongly that we ought to take that money and park it somewhere and never spend it, and invest and use the earnings to fund for scholarships for Pell eligible kids. And so I've got a bill to do that, to create a new foundation called Virginia College Opportunity Foundation. And Virginia 529 plan hates my bill. They want to keep their money. They want to decide how to spend it. They don't want us telling them how to spend it. And they would like to invest it advising kids on how to get to college or something, instead of actually funding scholarships.
Right. And so you're talking about we almost use it like an endowment where we park it and then use the income that it spins off for scholarships and things.
Yeah, because there's also a really big disconnect in Virginia between, for example, UVA, Tech, and William & Mary's endowments compared with the other 12 schools. UVA's endowment's like $15 or $16 billion. Texas, I think, pushing like $6 or $7 billion. William & Mary's over $1 billion. VMI is around $1 billion. And All the other schools are like all like collectively less than that, less than $1 billion. So they can't compete for Pell eligible students in nearly the same way that UVA, Tech, and William & Mary can. But they have just as much need. VCU, George Mason deal with a lot of Pell eligible kids, and JMU would like to have a lot more, but they just can't get them because they don't have the foundational resources to write those scholarship checks. So anyway, I'm hopeful we can find out common ground on that, and I think there's an agreement that college is too expensive. We ought to make it more accessible to everybody, but we often fight about how because of the lack of resources, and people don't want to take money from something to do it. And I'm hoping this money that dropped out of the sky can be used for that. So, that's.
Is anyone surprised that Senator Surovell said the one thing we'll find common ground is on how to send more kids to JMU?
So, what do you think? What do you think? What are you optimistic about?
What am I optimistic about?
No, Irene. I was going to ask Irene this time.
Irene. Yeah.
Oh, I'd like to hear Senator Surovell's take first as the experienced Grizzly.
All right. What else are you optimistic
member.
about, Senator Surovell?
Optimistic? Well, first of all, I'm optimistic that we're going to get out of there in 46 days because in an election year, everybody wants to get home, and we're not going to go late, and we're going to get some kind of budget done. We're not going to go into overtime like we did last time. I'm very optimistic about that. I think we'll probably find some more money for schools. I don't know how much, but there's no question. I think that everybody agrees that our teachers we're hemorrhaging teachers and cops. We have the largest by the way, we have a 17% vacancy rate in our state employment and state employees. It's like the highest it's ever been. You talk to every law enforcement agency, whether it's Fairfax, the state police, whatever, they've all got massive vacancies. And we're having the same problem in our schools. We're having a hard time attracting and retaining teachers. And a big part of that's pay. It's also, I think, the way a lot of my Republican colleagues like to treat teachers and tell them how to do their job, I think is a big part of it too. The lack of respect that we show to teaching professionals. But I think there's a consensus that we need to do what we can to get more money in to get the salaries in those professions up to where people aren't going to feel like they need to jump ship and go to another job. So I think we'll find some more money there. That usually does not translate to huge money for Fairfax because of our funding formula. 80% of our school budget is paid for locally, and there's good reasons for that. Some people don't like to hear me say that, but there are. But hopefully when the state dangles out the state's share of that teacher raise, the board of supervisors will post up their share, I hope, because our Fairfax teachers used to be the top paid in the state, and now they're paid $15,000 a year less in Arlington, and I think that needs to change.
Yeah, it's I think education generally is going to be. Hopefully, we can come up with some consensus items, but I think it'll also be one of the flashpoints, right? I know the governor thinks he got elected on the basis of this parents' rights movement. I know there's a bill that was introduced, and there's been a press conference, and there's a lot of talk about privatizing. I mean, just for a second, I'm going to editorialize the host, but we've seen attacks on transgender kids. We've seen attacks on critical race theory, accusations that we're using schools for indoctrination. All that is part of it's political, and part of it's about firing up their base, but part of it is also about a larger agenda, I think, of trying to privatize schools. And it's funny, I was on a panel for the Virginia Press Association, and the folks from the Americans for Prosperity admitted as much. Their view is that we're too different. Our society is too polarized. People are too different. They can't get along at the same schools anymore. And so we should just let everybody take their money and pick the school they want to go to. And if you don't like being around transgender kids, you can go to the school that discriminates. And if you don't like, if you want to learn a lot of math and science, you can go over here and you don't have to worry about English and history. And so I think part of what they're doing is trying to create an environment that feeds that narrative. And so I think we'll see a lot of that. Irene, what do you think we're going to be seeing of as far as positive, negative, whatever? What are you seeing out there? What are you hearing? What's the water cooler talk about? What to expect from session for you?
Well, I just want to answer the question like what I'm optimistic about, and I'm optimistic that this will be the last session we spend in the Pocahontas building.
There's that.
And I'm also optimistic that we'll see again the Senate sort of play the critical defensive role that we've seen them play and blocking all of the terrible stuff that's going to come out from the House, certainly. But more importantly, Delegate Simon, I'm curious to hear from you, also a seasoned veteran of the General Assembly. What are you optimistic about for this upcoming session?
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think the good news is we've got plenty of money to spend, right? I mean, we've got a good problem in that we have a $3.9 billion budget surplus at the midway point, which is like an unbelievably unprecedented amount of money to be trying to allocate at this mid-year sort of budget adjustment, thanks to, frankly, the great work that Governor Northam and Governor McAuliffe did for 8 years in creating a robust Virginia economy and making a lot of prudent decisions. The good news is that's the easier problem, right? How to spend all the surplus money is a much easier conundrum to deal with than years where we've had to say, where are we going to come up with all the shortfalls, right? And going back to localities, when I first got here, we had to go back to localities and say, hey, you need to give us back some of the money we gave you during the first half of the biennium because we can't afford that anymore, right? So that's the better problem to have to solve. I think it'll be, again, I think there's going to be an effort for Republicans to repay their benefactors through corporate tax cuts, the people that put them in office by giving them a lower corporate tax rate. I think there's some fertile ground to if we're going to have tax relief, to target it towards working people in Virginia and people that go and earn a living and get a paycheck every day. They deserve the tax break more than corporations do. So I think there's an opportunity to also, a lot of the money that we've got is a result of unusually high revenue that is not expected to repeat. So it's an opportunity to spend some money on some one-time things or things that have large startup costs that we couldn't afford to do in other years and years past. And so I think that Senator Barker and Senator Howell and Delegate Knight and the governor will come up with some ways to spend some of that money that'll be positive and have a positive effect on everybody. That's what I'm optimistic about. I think it's going to be a slog to get there, though, because I think that they're political in an election year. They're going to try and prioritize tax cutting and paint us, Democrats, as the party of higher taxes. And so how we navigate that and achieve what we want without letting them stick that label on us is going to be, I think, one of the more difficult things about session. So any final closing thoughts from either one of you? We got about 30 seconds each. Senator Surovell, why don't you go first?
Well, I would just say, I'm optimistic about this session. But what I think is really going to get interesting is after the session's over, we're going to have a lot of turnover in elections, a lot of primaries. It's going to be a very hot electoral season, not just in the whole state, but especially in Northern Virginia. There's going to be we're going to have it's going to be a very active 2 or 3 months right after the session ends, much more so than usually is. And so I think people in Fairfax County need to pay close attention to what's happening, because there's going to be a lot of primaries going on on June 20. And so,
all right, Irene, we got about 15 seconds for you to get the last word.
Session's going to move fast, but there are issues that you care about. You should make sure that your elected official hears from you on those issues, so that they can vote the way that you want them to vote. Stay engaged and keep an eye on it.
Yeah, you guys have seen our contact information below our faces throughout the broadcast. Reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And so that is all we've got. I am Marcus Simon, guest host. We've had Irene Shin from the House of Delegates and Scott Surovell from the State Senate. Thanks for joining us for this edition of the Inside Scoop.